Hello, welcome everybody who's just joining. We're just kind of getting logistics straightened out here in the School of Pharmacy. Thank you.
Yeah, we're very glad you're joining us today. So my name is, I'm a faculty member in the School of Pharmacy here in UW-Madison, where I teach in the history of intoxicants, pharmaceuticals, and I'm also an executive committee member for our psychedelic center, as well as an advisory committee member for the psychoactive pharmaceutical investigation program. And then lastly, I'm the historical director of the American Institute of History of Pharmacy. Amanda?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Pratt, for those of you that don't know me. And I have been working together to put this event on with some other colleagues, but I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm a PhD candidate at UW-Madison in the English department, and I have a sort of concentration in composition and rhetoric and a minor in science and technology studies. And I'm writing a dissertation about psychedelic rhetoric, which I'm happy to talk about at some point during the Q&A today. And I also am on the advisory board for the Transdisciplinary Center for Psychoactive Substances Research here at UW-Madison. I also, is that a kitty tail? I also Madison Psychedelic Society community group, and then I work for the nonprofit Porta Sophia, which might also come up today given our common relationship to trying to prevent bad psychedelic patents from here. We're excited to have you kind of technically second event in the Borghesi-Mellon shop. The first event happened half an hour ago or a couple hours ago, which is funded by the Center for Humanities here at UW-Madison. And the proposal for this workshop grew out of a working group here on campus that focuses on psychedelics and psychoactives from humanities and social science disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, we're really thrilled that you can be with us here in person and virtually. The idea behind this workshop really emerged the working group here at UW-Madison that is itself very disciplinary, where we have faculty and students from across campus contributing to what we hope is a meaningful dialogue around the nature of psychoactive and psychedelic substances in science and society. And so this working group is really composed of a broad swath of disciplines. We have representation from English, both literary studies and rhetoric. We have individuals from the School of Human Ecology. We have individuals from anthropology, Latin American, Caribbean, Iberian studies, horticulture. And what we wanted to do ultimately with this workshop is generate a conversation about psychedelics in society, but from outside of psychedelic clinical science and outside of drug development spaces. And the reason that we wanted to do that is hopefully generate a more nuanced and deeper understanding of what the psychedelic field and what psychedelic studies might look like in the years ahead.
Yeah, and so to that end, I'll just list some of the questions that we're kind of hoping that this workshop will help us to kind of foster inquiry around. So is it possible to reconcile psychedelics as medicine, sacraments, and dangerous drugs? Who do the compounds and plants benefit? Who has access? How are they being commodified? And what are the political and societal stakes of consciousness shifting? So this project contextualizes sociocultural and biomedical developments in psychedelic science and medicine and aims to bridge that gap between the humanities and the health sciences.
We need to thank a few people before we kick off, right?
I think so.
So it's a village, right? So we need to thank everyone who's here everyone who's in the virtual space. We want to thank Megan Messino at the Center for the Humanities, which is funding this workshop. We want to thank Tyler Dare, Sally Griffith-O, Kristen Falzone for creating the stellar graphics involved with this workshop. And then obviously I want to really extend gratitude to the speakers who are here with us today. And yeah, this doesn't work without your participation, so thanks.
Yeah. And so I can just read the description of what we're planning to do today with this roundtable titled Psychedelic Baselines, and then I'll do some introductions, or we'll maybe go back and forth on the introductions of our panelists here today. And just to give a sense of what this is going to look like, we will have each of them kind of speak for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to talk to one another, and then to the full audience to kind of weigh in and have a discussion about baselines. So the idea is that we have these panelists from different disciplines with different types of psychedelic experience or expertise to discuss their recent activities and outline key questions in the psychedelic renaissance, why these questions matter to the US and beyond, and what this Borghesi-Mellon workshop might provide in the way of kind of thinking through next steps for us here at UW. So additionally, the panel will consider hopefully some challenges within the contemporary psychedelic realm, of which there are many, as most of you are well aware, that need addressing in the months and years ahead, and providing a kind of baseline of understanding for those coming to the workshop from adjacent disciplines or fields outside of psychedelics. So yeah, goal of fostering conversations about psychedelics in society from within and outside of psychedelic clinical science and drug development. And then, do you want to start with Moshe's intro?
Absolutely. Dr. Deveneaux is a postdoctoral associate at the Institute for Research in Sensing, and that's at the University of Cincinnati, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at the Ohio State University, and the Medicine Society and Cultural Research Fellow with some, I can't not mention that. Her research examines the function of metaphor and other literary devices in narrative accounts of psychedelic experiences. And she also researches and teaches bioethics to psychedelic medicine. She was a founder of the Psychedemia Interdisciplinary Psychedelics Conference, a research fellow at the New York Public Library's Timothy Leary Papers, and a research fellow with the New York University Psilocybin Cancer Anxiety Study, where she participated in the first qualitative study of patient experiences.
And also on our panel today, or on our roundtable today, is Dr. Cody J. Wenther, who we have here in person as well. So Cody Wenther is an innovative translational investigator in psychopharmacology who has been on the UW-Madison faculty since 2018. His work is focused on improving our understanding of the basis of beneficial and detrimental effects of psychedelics, opioids, cannabinoids, and other neuroplasticity-inducing approaches in the context of novel therapeutic approaches for promoting and maintaining mental health. His research program has received grant and fellowship support from NIGMS, NIDA, and NIMH, independent foundations, and philanthropic funds. The resulting findings have been published in leading journals such as Nature and PNAS, and have yielded the development of first-in-class tool compounds and generated new pharmacologic techniques for the investigation of complex psychoactive mixtures. He also supports novel graduate education opportunities in neuropharmacology, including active service as the founding director of the Psychedelic Pharmaceutical Investigation Master's Program, which many of you are here today representing that program, and mentorship of PharmD and PhD students in pharmaceutical sciences, molecular and cellular pharmacology, and neuroscience.
And lastly, we have Graham Pechenik, a registered patent attorney and the founder of Calyx Law, a law firm specializing in cannabis and psychedelics related to intellectual property. Graham has a BS from UC San Diego, where he chose his cognitive neuroscience and biochemistry majors after his first psychedelic experiences inspired deep curiosity about the bases for changes in consciousness and a JD from New York University, where he initially pursued interests in bioethics and cognitive liberty. After a decade at large law firms defending and challenging patents for Fortune 500 companies across the agricultural, chemical, pharmaceutical, biotech, and technology industries, including working on several landmark patent cases, both at trial and on appeal, Graham started Calyx Law to help cannabis and psychedelic ventures design and implement their IPs. Graham also contributes to Psilocybin Alpha as editor-at-large, writing about psychedelics IP, providing data for patent trackers, and maintaining a psychedelics legalization and decriminalization tracker. And he is a member of Shakuna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. He was raised in Oakland, California, and currently lives in San Fran. Welcome to all of you.
Yeah, and that's a little dated. It's now Psychedelic Alpha, right, Graham? And also, I don't want to blow up your spot, but Graham just got married this weekend, or recently. So congratulations, Graham.
Thank you.
For spending this time with you when you should be like fasting in this. Cool.
So I think the first speaker is Dr. Winter.
News to me. No, thank you. So I just want to, I was asked to provide context sort of what my role is currently in the psychedelic landscape as a way to open up the conversation for your questions. I think roundtables are best and we have most time for questions, so I'll try to be relatively brief. I said this in the previous event, but I think it bears repeating. I think about how people got involved in a field. And for me, I became fascinated with the idea of how small molecules can change people's behavior long term, either for good or for ill, as the reason I got into psychedelics. And that was generated basically by my life experience here in Wisconsin with both immediate and more remote family members and friends having significant problems with alcoholism, and how that molecule was changing their life, often for the worse. And as I learned more about how, molecules interacted with the human body, I just became more and more fascinated by the idea that these very, very tiny things are essentially changing the entire trajectory of people's lives. And that led me down the path of trying to understand things like how neuroplasticity is modified by differential signaling in the glutamatergic system, and led to a real deep interest in sort of psychedelics as one of the possible ways in which people were reporting extremely strong, meaningful life events, often in the top 5 events in their life, and really changing the trajectory of where they were going. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to dedicate, basically half of my professional lab time to the question of how compounds like ketamine, psilocybin, and DMT, as well as other sort of novel tryptamines, interact with these the human CNS and the systems therein. And the other thing that I've been very fortunate to have is a series of really great colleagues here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the fact that those colleagues come from all of the different departments that you heard about earlier has really been transformative for my own sort of types of inquiries. And one of the active projects I want to talk about surrounding the question of who accesses psychedelic therapies, how do we manage questions about, are psychedelics dangerous drugs, are they medicines, are they sacraments, under which context do these exist, is a project that we're currently working on that I call POESIS. So it stands for Psychedelic Outcomes, the Intersection of Self-Identity, Environment, and Success. And this project really arose actually from conversation with Amanda Pratt, Alberto Vargas, and other collaborators from across and outside the country, in a workshop that Amanda proposed that we put together for the Arts Alliance at Research Universities, look at the role of sort of psychedelic cultures from the Huichol people to clinical trials, and brought in a Huichol artist as well as others to talk about the role of art in defining cosmology and interactions with psychedelic substances. And, I was fortunate to have a small part of that panel, but it really got me thinking about what we're actually doing in clinical trials here at UW. So we have a psychedelic dosing space that, to those who are familiar with this type of protocol, looks more similar to a room that might be within a person's house than it looks to something like a hospital room. But the question that kept bothering me is whose house does this look like? Because there's a bunch of art in that room. But it's never been extremely clear to me, at least in some of the pieces, who these pieces of art were selected by, what their choice was for why that art was selected. And it struck me as a real opportunity to explore this question of who gets to access psychedelics and under what context. And if we just circumscribe our scope to therapeutic contexts for the moment, one of the problems we have in clinical trials is that it's really easy to get wealthy, white, well-educated, urban people who are socially stable to raise their hand to come into psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy trials. And it's we've been very unsuccessful in getting folks with other life situations to join these trials. And because of that, and because we don't have systematic ways of thinking about what the art looks like in this room or why it's there, to me, the risk is that we are in sort of a feedback cycle where we're kind of tweaking the parameters of this room to fit a particular type of participant to maximize outcomes for that participant, at the risk of excluding everyone else and reducing generalizability. So the question that we're asking in this study is essentially, how does person's self-identity across the dimension of gender, age, ethnicity, race, as well as spirituality and religion intersect with people's responses to discrete art objects within the space, as well as their overall experience? And there's two arms to the study, one of which is looking at community members drawn from psychedelic societies across the United States to give them examples of these art pieces and have them assess the degree to which they're actually resonating with these art pieces and connecting to those different pieces of their identity. And the second piece is to build in a flexible digital display approach within our dosing space itself and work with local artists as well as art institutions like the Chazen Art Museum here in Madison to try and develop a suite of images that we then bring back to our community partners to say, are there images within this group that you feel are better representative of whatever social identity you are bringing to the table, in an effort to see whether that improves people's comfort with the setting, as well as a way to just sort of start plucking at the question of whether by introducing sort of non-standard pieces of art, we actually might be reducing variability by optimizing something more like a direct fit score between a person and the environment in which they're being dosed. And so we've been pretty successful in engaging. We've got about 150 participants for our survey, and we've been doing semi-structured interviews. We have about 20 of those talking that are getting at qualitative measures around this. And at the end of the day, what I hope to see come out of this study is not some number or some menu, of standardized art pieces that we think should be in a room, but really to see insights into whether centering individuals, both within trials, but also in the other context of psychedelic use, and acknowledging that people are coming to this from very different places and are bringing different pieces of their identity to the fore. If by doing that, we can maximize potential beneficial outcomes and minimize risks for people using psychedelics. So that's the main piece of research I want to talk about. We also have some other more mechanistic things, but I think in the interest of time and the theme of this talk, that makes the most sense. The other thing that I do want to highlight, as Luke pointed out, is I'm really fortunate to be the founding director of the TPI program. And I think part of the question of who accesses psychedelics and how do we set up structures to wrangle with the very broad standing challenges of integrating this type of relatively new approach where it's both a combined psychotherapy and a medicine, again, just in the context of therapeutic use, into a very strongly structured healthcare system is one that demands that a lot of new folks enter the fray, because if we are going to massively expand access to psychedelics through FDA approval or through decriminalization or other mechanisms, we have a huge gap between the amount of education that is available to the general public and to professionals and right now, and what is actually needed. And so developing experts in that area who can then continue to provide best practices and best state of knowledge it is something that I think is really important, not just for us in our program, but for everyone who's working in the psychedelic field to think about. Because if you unleash a new modality to a lot of people who haven't been thinking about this deeply, I think the risks begin to escalate. Because we certainly have cultures for whom psychedelics have been well integrated in the cosmology, their worldview, their spiritual use. But that's not the case in non-homogeneous U.S. society, certainly. And so to me, I think that's a really big question. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, we encourage big questions. And Graham, can I turn it over to you now?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Cody. And if people can't hear me, I guess shout, but hopefully you can hear me all right. Yeah, I suppose my professional background also got interested, started with my interest in how small molecules changed experiences of my own. I think you heard in my introduction that I got my interest in psychedelics after my own first experiences with them, and then ended up as a patent lawyer, mostly because I found out that there was some naivete in thinking I could do drug policy or cognitive liberty and still pay off law school loans. But I sort of found my interest in patents around realizing that there was sort of this perversity in between the fact that patents are really designed, or supposedly so, to increase innovation and to create more and more inventions, but in practice and really across different industries, but especially in the pharmaceutical industry, which is sort of where I ended up, given my background in biochemistry and neuroscience, they end up actually sort of slowing down innovation and producing what often can't really be seen as innovation. So maybe kind of before I get there, I imagine there probably are not many patent lawyers in the audience or any, so I guess I can give a little bit of a summary of the patent law. And I suppose just by kind of starting, I mean, a patent, if you're sort of semi-familiar with it, it's a bargain that the government grants for a certain period of time to provide an exclusive right over an invention. And an invention is usually defined by what are called claims in the patent document. And then the patentee has 20 years basically to have the exclusive rights to practice what's in those claims. And so that bargain is really how we see the patent as being something that, for the benefit to the public of having this new invention and disclosing it, the public through the government grants the patent owner the right to use that exclusively. In terms of, I guess, my own kind of work and how I think about where this bargain breaks down, I usually think about it kind of at the level of each individual patent. So sometimes patents, just seeing them as a product of the patent system, we can see flaws in the way that they were examined and the way they're granted. We can kind of step out behind that and look at like individual applicants for patents, individual inventors, and whether or not the type of innovation that they're getting patents on can be what we would expect or desire as, you know, the public that's granting this benefit. And then more broadly, looking at the ways that the patent system affects different inventors sort of across a emerging kind of like ecosystem like psychedelics. Like, what does it mean once companies in the psychedelic space start using patents individually and together? What does that mean for sort of innovation? What does it mean for just the kind of orientation of the space and the evolution of it? You know, where does it end up? Does it end up somewhere where innovation kind of stalls, where consumers or people have less access or have to pay more for therapies? Does it mean that there is perhaps more innovation? And so those, I think, are kind of the questions maybe that we can get to by looking through the patent system. But in the pharmaceutical space, which is where we have the most experience with patents, we can generally see that the kind of bargain with the public has broken down, and the fact that most pharmaceutical drugs have longer than the sort of 20-year monopoly they're supposed to have, many of them because the companies that are filing for them file hundreds of patents on single drugs. They have 30, 40, even 50-year monopolies. They are able to charge monopoly prices for them. There's less and less innovation. And it's actually the fact that there is innovation really around what's patentable rather than what's bringing benefits to patients is sort of, I got my start in the pharmaceutical industry for branded pharma and kind of saw the way that patent lawyers work. And typically what, you know, patent lawyers and big pharma call like life cycle management, or people who are critical of it might call evergreening or thicketing. Most energy really is going to trying to find ways to extend monopolies for, you know, drugs that are already on the market, really, rather than bringing truly innovative drugs to market. Obviously, drug development is harder than finding ways to patent to sort of incremental advances on drug formulations and things. So if we kind of like step toward the psychedelic space, you know, we can see that we're already like operating inside of a system that's in pretty dire need of reform, but there's differences with psychedelics themselves that make this bad system kind of even worse. Psychedelics, of course, have far less of the traditional sort of prior art that a patent examiner would look at to determine whether something is truly novel and inventive. So, you know, Amanda said that one of the things that, you know, her and I have been in contact about is the nonprofit organization Porta Sophia, which is a prior art library that's been gathering psychedelics related prior art to make it available to patent examiners to use to examine patents and hopefully reject patents if, you know, a patent is kind of overreaching into what would be the prior art, and also filing oppositions to make sure that bad patents or overbroad patents don't get granted. But because of this lack of traditional prior art, there's especially this danger in the psychedelic space that these low quality, or they're often called patents that are kind of overreaching, will be granted and actually withdraw what's sort of in the commons into market exclusivity for companies. And of course, this can lead to like rent-seeking behavior as companies sort of turn their efforts towards litigation rather than continued innovation, and creates a lot of transaction costs for especially smaller companies trying to enter the market. So, you know, I've already spoken, for instance, to people trying to like potentially set up clinics. They want to use a drug, even just like psilocybin, because there's now dozens of companies who have filed hundreds of patent applications. You know, what are their risks of infringing a method of treatment claim on, you know, something like psilocybin, even though, you know, to be able to say with great confidence, this is something that's been done for, you know, decades or hundreds of years, or maybe lots of records of it being used in kind of underground therapy, you might say, but there isn't the type of evidence that would have made it to a patent office. And we've already seen patents being granted on some of these things. Of course, this also sort of elides one of the bigger issues that's specific to psychedelics, although it has come up in pharmaceuticals elsewhere, given the fact that a lot of pharmaceuticals do rely on natural products, is that psychedelics, many of them are based on traditional and indigenous knowledge too, you know, work that may not even fit with what we call prior art and really goes without sort of recognition or reward. And there are some efforts within the psychedelic space to provide benefit sharing and reciprocity, but these are things that are more broadly overlooked, certainly overlooked by the pharmaceutical space and can be here as well. And then just kind of generally, the sort of ethos of cooperation and collaboration, which is very much in tension with what we think of with the patent system, which is really a system meant for, by design, extracting profits from a specific invention to a specific company. And so, it was only, I think, 4 years ago or so today, there was a statement on open science and open practice that many companies and researchers and people across the space signed on to, many of which who went on from those signatures, which were putting their names beside a document that said that they would make all their work public domain where they could and not put it behind the exclusion of patents, have moved on maybe to companies, and many of them filed patent applications themselves. And so, I did mention that these sort of design features of the patent system are sort of optimized for profit maximization and kind of winner-take-all capitalism, and the way that the system itself, by awarding patent rights to like individual inventors, kind of sits on this Western ideal of this kind of lone genius inventor, kind of alone at his workbench, and kind of waiting for the eureka moment, even though many of these inventions, even if we call them that, are obviously resting on community and traditional wisdom, many of them. And then also just the fact that, coming back to the very bargain itself of the patent, it kind of suggests this invisibility of like intrinsic motivation, so that the patent bargain assumes that we all sort of act by rational self-interest, and that's what drives our behavior. And so we can query whether these incentives either are necessary, or also whether there are other incentives we can design to produce kind of innovation. And so some have questioned whether we should have patents on psychedelics at all, but there are kind of other ways to go about maybe addressing some of the problems. So one of them, of course, is the Porta Sophia that we mentioned. Another one is just patent reform, and so there are efforts certainly to try to fix some of the issues like what Porta Sophia is trying to address. There's actually a Senate bill right now by Senators Leahy and Tillis around trying to give patent examiners more time to produce better quality patents and find prior art, although some of that prior art, as we mentioned, may not even be available to them. Just raising the standards for patents, but also trying to find ways to sort of operate outside the patent system. Patents, as I mentioned, by their design, are meant to be sort of profit maximizing, but they needn't be. And actually, some of the best examples of successful ecosystems for innovation have been because they've been led by companies or organizations who have not put as much effort into sort of policing the boundaries of their patent rights, or granted licenses on pretty open terms. So like the very start of the recombinant DNA era, most of those foundational patents were owned by the UC system and by Stanford, who had a very flexible and kind of open licensing regime. And had that not happened, a lot of people speculate that it would have been many years, or that whole ecosystem wouldn't have flourished certainly as soon as it did. And there's been something similar to that with CRISPR, but other ways, and I guess to maybe speak a little bit about sort of like the work I'm doing myself. I mean, so I think it was mentioned with Psychedelic Alpha. One of the things we do is collect all the patent applications relating to psychedelics and make them available. So sort of the hope is there to be able to have them just more visible, so that people can see what applications are being granted, where innovation may be potentially blocked, where it may be moving, just to have the prior art even for themselves. Sometimes companies have perhaps filed applications without understanding themselves that they may be overreaching into certain prior art because they haven't done those searches. Also just with individual companies who are perhaps hopeful that they can be able to kind of strike a balance between raising the investment they want to be able to perform innovation, but not block others from doing that. So companies have pursued things like patent pledges to not assert their patents against particular companies or to license them more freely, but to still be able to sort of have the incentive to have the ability to raise money for drug development. And then also just more broadly looking at things like finding ways to shift the sort of either ownership structure or the incentive structure for that kind of the way that the patent sits as a means for obtaining the investment and then kind kind of funneling that money to a single company. So there's other ways like crowdfunding money or something I've worked with some colleagues have developed around pay for success contracts. So finding other ways other than using patents, and then also taking ways to sort of fractionalize the ownership away from a single company, potentially to decentralized communities through things like IP NFTs, to be able to have the sort of, I guess, the governance structure of a particular patent rights owned more broadly. But I guess maybe I'll pause there too, because I've probably gone a little bit long, but I'm like hopeful to discuss some of these things. I'm happy to answer some questions later.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Can I turn over to Nishay?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to discussing as well. So my background is in the psychedelic humanities, specifically literature. I think literature is a really important storehouse of alternative frames for how we might conceptualize our relationship to psychedelics, both historical frames and cross-cultural frames. And I think it's really important to keep diving into these alternative models when currently there's a lot of funding and financial capital and other kind of power behind a specific model of what psychedelic medicine looks like in the West. And I really strongly advocate for a blended approach to this question of, in what cases are psychedelics harmful, in what cases they're medicine. They're so context specific that we shouldn't be trying to constrain them to one context. And so I just wanted to mention kind of a few examples of stuff I've been working on recently, just to show how I personally approach some of these themes. So recently I published an article titled "Dark Side of the Shroom: Erasing Indigenous and Counterculture Wisdoms with Psychedelic Capitalism and the Open Source Alternative," that I co-wrote with Richard Doyle and Trey Connor. And in that piece, I interrogate a bit of the neoliberal kind of capitalist assumptions behind how we tend to conceptualize healing in the West. And this metaphor I came across recently really helps to highlight what I see as part of the nature of the problem. It was in a Guardian article by Sana Asan, who wrote, speaking of the kind of Western approach to medicine, if a plant were wilting, we wouldn't diagnose it with wilting plant syndrome. We would change its conditions. Yet when humans are suffering under unlivable conditions, we're told something is wrong with us and expected to keep pushing through. And I think it's really important to kind of think about that metaphor specifically in light of what some of the, psychedelic capitalists are trying, the narratives that are commonly advanced in the field about, especially some of you may have heard, there's been a lot of news recently about the failure of SSRIs, antidepressants, to address mental health challenges. And a lot of people have been talking, especially recently, because the paper came out a month or so ago, talking about how basically making the argument that the chemical imbalance model of what causes distress is a limited approach, and that we shouldn't be looking for magic bullets to solve problems when we're living in an environment that is inherently hostile to mental flourishing. So if we can think about psychedelics as part of a bigger picture, but we can't ignore the fact that there are issues with capitalism. For example, the inequality of society is fueling problems like the increase in fascism, political polarization, climate change. And yet those are all specific things that certain psychedelic capitalists have said psychedelics can solve. I think it's extremely naive to hold that perspective. It can be a tool, but if you're not willing to look at the environmental pollution, you're not going to meaningfully solve those problems. And that requires structural changes. So in terms of the literature that I'm interested in looking at, One example is the Alexander and Shulgin, and recently passed away, wrote the books Tikal and Tikal, where it's essentially, it's a hybrid genre where they combine the technical cookbook for how to make all of these novel, in many cases, psychedelic substances. And yet the other side of the book is a literary exploration of how both that couple specifically, but their whole community develop practices around psychedelics. And the way in my book project that I'm currently working on is I'm really interested in metaphors and how they can help us think differently about things. And I make the argument that these books are essentially like psilocybin mushroom grow kits themselves, because what happened historically back in the 90s, in the height of the war on drugs, there was a lot of, clamping down. It basically became impossible for Shulgin to do, Alexander Shulgin, to do the kind of research that he wanted to do. And so he contained the seed of this future psychedelic science that we're sort of starting to step into in the cookbook part of the book. But I argue the literature side of it is as essential. It's the medium that allows for that future science to flourish, because it describes a way of sharing information about psychedelics through an approach of mutual aid, where even simple things like you need to pre-measure the supplemental dose before you need to take it, because by the time you need it, you're not going to be able to measure it. Simple ground that can share and circulate through the storytelling. So basically what I argue is that there is this kind of war on drugs paradigm, drawing on the work of Kenneth Tucker, who wrote Psychoactive Substances in the English Language, that was preventing the science from happening back in 91, 94 when these books came out. And that the literature side of it was, there's this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Altered Carbon, Netflix, and also a book, but they talk about this concept of shifting the construct, where it's like the hegemonic norms of society can be altered. And it's through storytelling and language that we can help to shift those frameworks. And so to circle back to the psychedelic capitalism issue, and this gets back to a quote that I shared in the earlier conversation from Mark Fisher. He says that emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of the natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. So that science was not possible back in the 90s. And they created a culture, the seed of a culture that can go out and share this mutual aid and information that could help build an alternative culture that could see that future science through. And so I think it's moments like that in storytelling and literature that we need to look to in order to shift the attempted hegemony by aspirational monopolists who want to say, you have to go to our clinic and do it in a specific way, and that's your only option. Because a lot of people in this field are here not because they were in a clinical trial. Many people are here because they have a meaningful experience in the woods, on the beach, with friends, with people that they have relationships to. They're not carted off somewhere else with strangers. They're in dynamic community with people that psychedelics can become a part of building community locally. And just one last thing I'd like to end on, an example of, we have to interrogate the way that we talk about the history of psychedelics and specifically psychedelic literature, because I was surprised to find out through the work of Lana Cook, who's another English PhD, that there were mass market paperback books, bestsellers, written by women in the 50s and 60s that we just don't talk about. We talk about Huxley, we talk about Timothy Leary, barely talk about Maria Sabina, not in a meaningful way, oftentimes as a tokenized gesture of appropriation. And so I looked at these books because I was interested in, like, why aren't these books being read? And I read one of them by Constance Newland, and it was really awkward and difficult. And I was tempted. I was like, I don't want to write a chapter on this. This is a weird book. And I started thinking, but why am I so resistant? What is so weird about this text? And I realized that the women had to write under pseudonyms. They couldn't even, they felt like they couldn't, as women, speak openly about their psychedelic interests. But Constance Newland specifically sought out psychedelics because she had read Huxley, and she had a psychonautic interest in exploring consciousness. but the only way she could access psychedelics was through a medicalized context. It says, when I met for a first interview with Dr. M in charge of the LSD project, I knew only that I wanted a glimpse of the new creation as described by Mr. Huxley, for which glimpse I was willing to volunteer for whatever psychological tests might be necessary. And then she adds, since I had been psychoanalyzed and I was functioning well, I was at a loss for a specific problem. She didn't have an issue that she wanted to kind of come in with, but then she realized, until I realized that I had never overcome my frigidity, only then did Dr. M accept me as a subject. And I looked into the history and I was like, frigidity, does this mean just not interested in sex? And actually, no. It means, in the term, in the time, a woman who could not orgasm from penetrative sex alone, which today is a normal variation of biology, but it was pathologized. And then her entire trip, I mean, imagine if Huxley was told, you have to, if you want to take mescaline, you have to meditate upon how you can't please your wife. And that affected the text that came out, but we can learn from that, is what I argue. Even the texts that are uncomfortable and challenging, there are gems of insight. And the way that the ideas actually played out in her experience, paradoxically, she came out at the end as a kind of free woman who didn't need men anymore. And it was like paradoxically counter to what ostensibly the goal of the therapy had been. So I just wanted to mention those examples. Thank you.
Well, that's amazing. And I want to thank the speakers. I'm going to circle back to what Cody said right at the very beginning, which is that we really just want to make sure there's loads of time for Q&A. That's the best kind of roundtable. We can show that the table is very, very round. So we're going to take questions from the audience, and you can use the chat function if you want to ask a question, or you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself. Just remember, a reminder, this Borghesi-Mellon workshop, and this is the very first one of a series, is intended to foster conversations around psychedelics in society, within science, and then help generate a better understanding of how we'll do psychedelic work here at the UW campus. So it's just a reminder briefly. And so if there are any comments or questions, I think the floor is now open for anyone. We have a question down here.
Unless there is somebody online. So I'm really curious to hear the panelists' views on the current state of the psychedelic industry in terms of where are the needs, the most felt needs, and where are the priorities. There are a big mismatch or match between priorities and needs in the industry. And what does the drug pipeline look like? Like, is there an issue with the drug pipeline of what's anticipated to come out? And again, going to the current state of the industry, what's the state of acquisitions, takeovers, and monetization? 101 on psychedelic industry status.
I was waiting for Graham to take the lead, but I'm happy to chip in first.
Graham, could you hear the question?
I could hear part of it. I mean, I can repeat back what I think I heard. Something about the drug development or drug discovery pipeline. And then also, I think about the resources. Are the resources, is there like maybe you could repeat that part. And then I think there was a third part I didn't quite hear all the way to.
Can you repeat?
Well, can you repeat it and I'll take it?
Sure. Again, just asking what's the current state of match between needs, felt needs, and felt priorities? What's the extent of match between the two? Is there a mismatch? And then connected to the particular case of this, what's the drug pipeline looking like, the drug discovery pipeline? What's the broader status of monopolization, acquisitions in the industry right now?
So what was the third one? The current status of
acquisitions.
Acquisitions.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. So I can, I guess, maybe address those in order. I mean, I think the the first question is really a question that depends on what you think the felt needs are. I mean, so I can certainly tell you to those who think that there is a big need for new patented, new chemical entities, there's a pretty big match between the sort of the money that's going to companies and kind of what the companies are doing. So I guess you can have to back up and query whether that's your priority. But almost all of the venture capital money and private investment right now is going towards drug discovery, basically. And there are dozens of companies, maybe even over 100, who are looking at basically optimizing the classic psychedelics that we have already for different characteristics, mostly either to get away from particular side effects. So probably the biggest one is 5-HT2B agonism. So some drugs like psilocybin, not only are they 5-HT2A agonists, but they also agonize the 2B receptor, which is more peripherally located, and agonism can cause like heart issues, especially when it's taken chronically. So I would say people are optimizing towards things that can be taken on a regular basis. So this wouldn't be a concern if people are just having 3 or 5 or 10 or even every weekend psilocybin, a larger dose. But if you're taking it on a daily basis, like for microdosing, potentially it could be. And most pharmacologists, David Nichols and Brian Roth and others kind of agree with that. And of course you have to ask, the reason we're looking at chronic drugs is because this is where the money would be if you're a pharmaceutical company looking for something that can be taken on a daily basis. So that can be a question around priorities too. Priorities are things that will be cheaper in the clinic, things that may even not have psychedelic effects at all. There's a lot of money, and one of the companies that raised some of the most was Felix, and one of the first big NIDA grants was actually to Brian Roth's lab to look at drugs that don't have hallucinogenic effects. So should that be a priority? Should we get all the way away from even having a trip with your with your psychedelic? When I sometimes think about priorities, I'm often reminded of something that Joe Green said at Horizons conference last year, which was pointing out that $5.5 million were spent in the state of Oregon bringing Measure 109, which probably most people know, legalized psychedelic assisted therapy with psilocybin in the state. $5.5 million, in one state. Maybe Oregon's a little special given their politics and the sort of need. But if you were to take that across the country, and presumably there's going to be countries that, states in the country, you're not going to be able to get that pass. But just looking generally at drug policy reform and generally at legalization of this, it's going to be orders of magnitude less than some of the hundreds of millions of dollars that have already gone into, the next best form of psilocybin. So in that sense, and I often wonder, coming back to sort of the patent system, the patent system is incentivizing people to try to find ways where they can spend sort of the lower amount of investment up front for reaping the, the big rewards that come with a, billion-dollar blockbuster drug. But how many billion-dollar kind of bets on blockbuster drugs we need versus building out infrastructure, building out training, coming up with, culturally appropriate care versus, Cody, you mentioned like whose artwork gets chosen. The first patent application that has a piece of art that has good effects with psilocybin, there will be a patent on it, and everybody will license a patent, and soon enough you'll find a single painting hanging behind everybody's bed in the therapy room. And we already saw, like, one of the most notorious patents, of course, is compasses with patent claims on things like soft furniture and high definition sound systems, and the next one might have something like artwork. So the sort of priority towards driving towards monopoly and kind of monoculture is maybe met, but it's probably not a priority that everybody necessarily shares. So I probably forgot some of the other things you mentioned, but yeah, the drug pipeline, like I said, hundreds, and I'm not sure what your third question is now, but I've probably already spoken too long. So maybe
about the patterns of monopolization, is that indeed happening? And to what extent is monopolization happening?
Monopolization, I think it's probably a little bit too early to tell, just because, there's nothing yet on the market, and there's not really all that many patent rights yet granted, given the the hundreds that have been filed. But I think certainly there's been statements on the record by companies like Atai and Compass about how they'll protect their IP, and for ones that were early to file, and others that are still sort of stealth, like there's a company, Terran, that's announced having hundreds of patent applications already. Some of these companies are basically using them specifically with purposes of trying to sort of edge into their competitors' markets and potentially, get sway over it. I mean, there was actually just maybe getting too deep in the weeds, but if people know Field Trip has a kind of new chemical entity that they've patented, which is a prodrug of one of Shulgin's tryptamines. There's another company called Camtech that just actually patented a crystalline form of it, which probably will be the form that actually would be the one to make it in the clinic, with the sort of goal, of course, one would assume, of using that patent application to try to get licensing fees from Field Trip, who was sort of there first, but wasn't there first with their patent strategy. And so, I mean, the whole goal of people filing all these patents really is for purposes of having as much of, the monopolization as kind of they can, get out of the patent office.
Yeah, I think my other comment on this would be the disconnect that I sort of see from a stated goals and an actual investment strategy, right? Is you hear people always paying lip service to the idea of we're doing this to improve mental health, right? To address the mental health crisis. And a quote that comes to mind for me on this front is from Marie Curie, who said, "I was taught the way of progress is neither swift nor easy." And I think that's really important for us to think about in this context, because there's a group of companies that are going for the swiftest possible route forward, right, which may rely on compounds that are already known as a way to break the space open. And then there's another group of companies that are working on NTEs, right, with the idea that once the space is broken open, now you can change, improve, and modify. But what that all sort of misses is that in order for any of this to be successful, if indeed the compounds are shown to be safe and effective, they have to get to people. They have to get into people's bodies, right? They have to be combined with psychotherapy or some other context that's been shown to be a safe container. And we have mental health care shortages in basically every single region of this country. And to think that we can just plug in quickly, swiftly, and easily one molecule or one suite of molecules into the existing infrastructure and expect to see change makes no sense to me personally. And this gets back to some of what Michelle was saying about there's incentives to put this sort of magic bullet lens on psychedelics, and both from the personal standpoint, right, of having to go through the work of preparation and integration, figure out what it is that your particular situation is leading to in regard to your mental health. That same lesson, I think, applies to the psychedelic industry as a whole, and we're ignoring at our peril investment in that translational piece, the infrastructural piece.
Just to hop on that for a quick second, yeah, just when I mentioned Constantine's example, we don't want people to be kind of fogging up the mental health support pipeline because they don't have alternative ways of accessing it. And they're coming up with, like we saw with the early days of cannabis in California, of like making up, a specific, medical issue just because that's the only thing you can have access to the substance. So there's an argument there for diversifying approaches as well.
Yeah, and your example made me think of actually, if we're thinking of building access to training and people who are qualified, this exact situation comes up, right? In some of the clinical trials that are out there for getting access to training, it's been a real problem for people to get access to these substances. And for some ketamine examples, for example, they sort of have a made-up diagnosis, right, for why they were in that trial to be trained for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy kind of in the first place. And we're seeing shades of the same thing, right? As people are finding fake pathologies so they can get access for whatever their ultimate actual goal is. And if we have limited bandwidth, that's counterproductive.
So I see a question from the virtual audience. Cora, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Cora Brumley here, PPI capstone student. So Cody, you sort of perfectly segue my observations and I guess concerns. So I wanted to thank Nessie for bringing up the experiences women in psychedelics had in past history, and sort of correlate it to the idea that maybe things aren't really that different, that, you know, in a medical setting, women still traditionally have a much harder time accessing the care they need and the timeliness that they need. And this sort of concerns me. So this is sort of a counterpoint to, certainly I hear, you know, Dr. Wenther, what you're saying about, you know, made up conditions, but also I think about the author of, I'm trying to think the name of the book that we studied, Blue Dreams, where a woman with a psychiatrist with a significant mental health disorder went through all the different paths. And then finally, when there was maybe perhaps some hope in the psychedelic realm, it turns out that, you know, she was no longer eligible because, you know, this is an ugly way to say it, but her receptors were burned out. So I'm curious what the group thinks about how do we balance the need to, you know, make sure that yes, people have a medical condition that is appropriate for these potential remedies, but then also balance that, knowing that there is systemic impediments, particularly for women and women of color, to actually receive the medical care that they know they need. So again, on a reproductive level, a gentleman might have an issue with ED and boom, he's got a prescription. Women, on the other hand, I can't tell you how many women I know that have had, you know, years and years and years of symptoms related to the reproductive care that they were pushed aside and not, you know, taken seriously. And it took a decade, 15 years to finally get the medical care that they required, simply because of, you know, their plumbing and our systemic inequities. So I just love to hear, I know there's no magic answer, but I'd love to hear what maybe some of the strategies are for addressing that sort of impediment and challenge.
No, I think just to start off, I think part of it is having a lot more education around things like racism and ableism and sexism and solutions to those in all kinds of higher education contexts, including in the sciences. That's one argument for increasing kind of transdisciplinary education, is that we need to know about the extent of these problems in order to begin to address it. And the other piece is increasing diversity among the people who are developing the field, the people who are brought in to kind of be conversant with how these pipelines, how these pathways are being developed. Because if you have, you know, for a long time, for example, like I was one of the only non-men coming to psychedelic and speaking at psychedelic conferences because it was just so predominantly white male. And so there's been some strides in that, but there's still a long way to go. And that starts with education and being able to mentor and support people from an early stage and specifically addressing their needs. So, you know, people that don't have parents in higher education, they don't know necessarily how to advocate for themselves as a student and to connect with resources on campus. So being able to do that legwork to make sure that students are here from all walks of life and are supported to succeed as one step towards larger systemic changes.
Yeah, to jump off that a little bit, I couldn't agree more about the need for education about marginalized or different perspectives in psychedelic curricula as we build them. And I think Luke's histories course does a good job of starting to do that, and hopefully we can continue to build on that. I think the other thing that I'll say from sort of a biomedical lens is, you know, we're seeing psychedelics being studied for many different formal disorders, right, that are in the DSM, as well as things that actually are poorly defined in terms of disorders, which to my eye is actually helpful that we're sort of recognizing the limitations of the DSM, because there has sort of long been a disconnect between what we understand about fundamental neurobiology and circuitry and the way that we do sort of symptomatic clustering for diagnosis, right? And so for people to have to pass through the gate of having a particular disorder may not actually be extremely helpful, even from like a very reductionist biological lens, where there are symptomatic clusters or biological differences, right, within circuitry that may underlie a suite of disorders. And so I think the fact that psychedelics are being studied in this way actually is highlighting a disconnect between kind of the practice of psychiatry and medicine and how that's driven by billable hours, right? Because you got to be able to charge for what you do if you want to continue to hang out your shingle and be a physician, at least in our current capitalist independent payer system. And the reality that psychiatric disorders are extremely comorbid and that wellness is a goal of many people who don't have and probably should not have any formal diagnosis, and that we should be thinking about tools to promote wellness and thriving rather than just tools to address overt dysfunction. So I think that's one way to try and improve access to folks who would otherwise be sidelined, is to rethink what the gate is that gets you access.
And I just want to jump in and say that I think it's worth thinking about, like, in relation to your question, Cora, also like what sorts of positionalities are willing to even have a psychedelic experience, to be able to like let go and lose all of that control, to be able to sit in that room, because shit is terrifying, right? Like, or it can be, especially if you're, you know, I don't know. I learned this in a science and technology studies class a long time ago, but there was like a study about risk, and it was like between women and men, what they're most afraid of about the opposite sex. And the men said they were afraid of being laughed at, and the women said they were afraid of being killed. And so I think about that all the time, because I think it just puts into stark contrast, like the whole history of the field as being male dominated, and these psychonauts that are like plumbing the depths of their psyches. And like, it's just not a privilege that is granted to women, people of color, people that are not just totally comfortable with just letting go of all control of reality. So just throw that in there.
I guess I'll also add, from the historian's perspective, that the state of the literature has been equally male dominated, and that the stories that we tell, evidence-based stories that we tell, have often been about Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, Humphrey Osmond, and you can just list off white male after white male after white male. And it's only relatively recently that historians have begun to foreground women, people of color, people that have been marginalized. And you see that Shakruna has created a series around women in psychedelics. You see this at Symposia as well, where you're beginning to see these stories that are uncovered, which with more and more stories like this, we begin to socialize and re-socialize this space and make it more palatable for everyone to have a voice. And I guess, Cora, this is something that we've been thinking about too. And what is the nature of transdisciplinarity? What is, how is it operationalized? And one thing that this group has been focusing on is the types of scholars that are built into the transdisciplinary infrastructure. So women and gender studies scholars, queer studies scholars help to amplify these voices that have been marginalized in the past.
Was there another question here?
I just had a question for the panelists about the well, there have been there's been some major coverage by major media outlets about the breakthroughs, if you will, with psychedelic research, and I'm wondering about the implications of this level of coverage and the level of public awareness that's sort of sprouting out.
I'd watch this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you should. I'm just transcribing for the chat for folks that can't. Yeah, so the question was about like the sort of breakthrough media splashy headlines, if I'm reading, maybe I'm reading into it based on my own.
Correctly.
But, you know, I study the rhetoric of psychedelics, which is basically how people talk about psychedelics. And so to me, this is like very central to what I'm talking about all the time. And I think that it is a huge, huge problem, right? And so I've talked to all of you collaborators in this room about this a lot, but you know, I think there's an issue of like trying to balance this like true promise of psychedelics with these like big like panacea narratives, right? That aren't necessarily very responsible. And so I've looked at, you know, it's for me, it's like a sort of a harm reduction issue, right? Because like people will see a headline potentially and like have no idea anything remotely like potentially bad about what could happen in a difficult psychedelic experience, which is probably some people in the room know can be pretty difficult. And like those narratives are the kind of driving force behind this huge wave of medicalization and investment and the eye of Sauron. Yeah. So I don't know. That's sort of like the gist, but I would love to. Gabe and I have been working on a class in collaboration with Luke that talks about like communicating about psychedelics ethically. And so I think there's that's a workshop discussion for that we could do a whole, you know, day on, but.
Yeah, I would say, you know, attention is a double-edged sword. We've talked a lot about the need for further education for, you know, the public to have a better, more nuanced understanding. I don't think that's possible without there being more attention being placed on psychedelics as there's now reason we're having these discussions today and not 30 years ago. But the other side of the sword, I won't, you know, repeat what Amanda said, but I think the other part of that sword is disillusionment and actually very real risks, pragmatic risks of elevated expectations and potential harm to participants currently or patients or people, you know, using psychedelics if they have elevated expectations and they buy into this, you know, quick fix narrative, and it isn't the quick fix that they thought it would be. You may actually have people, you know, getting worse, right? And that's a risk. Again, to continue on my theme, like at the individual level, but also at the societal level, because it's not going to take many stories of someone took psychedelics, they had a psychotic break or hallucinogen, you know, perceptual persisting disorder or some other very negative outcome to come out before every media outlet is going to jump on that story. Now people are going to go, you told me these were great and now you're telling me they're horrible and I don't know what to do. And so I think tempering hype with balanced, reasonable education is the best we can possibly do. That's my.
I would just add to that there are quite powerful elements of the psychedelic field that have explicitly attempted to marginalize or silence people who are speaking up about potential risks and potential for harm or real instances of risk and harm. And in many cases, repeatedly over, looks like as long as I've been in the field, which has been, you know, over a decade, there's been this narrative that if you speak up about risk or harm or, you know, dangerous people involved in the community, that you are jeopardizing the future of psychedelics in society. And that kind of stakes, I think we need to completely move beyond that mythological narrative, because if the people who care about psychedelics are nuanced already and able to acknowledge the risks and benefits and work towards building a safer, you know, psychedelic access pipeline for everyone, then it will be better for the field when things happen to say, look, we've done X, Y, and Z. We are taking this extremely carefully and extremely seriously and putting a lot of energy and attention towards listening when people speak up, to respecting whistleblowers, respecting the watchdogs, and not accusing them of jeopardizing the field. I think that will lead to a healthier community overall.
Very quickly to follow up a question on the hype. So the hype is still persisting, or would you say that there is more of a balance now? There's a movement toward a more moderate outlook. And secondly, is the hype actually having a benefit, not a benefit, but a function in driving investment portfolios? That it's actually a business model for venture capitalists, etc., and that helps in that sense to have the hype. Question. That's just the question.
I'll just say quickly to the second point, and maybe Graham, you can chime in on this too, because I know it's a key part of your methodology of tracking patents, but there's this kind of dark period where a patent application, is submitted, and then there's a dark period where the public can't access it. And the reason that people the Psychedelic Alpha is able to kind of say, here's what's coming down the line, is because these companies put out press releases, right, to say like, here's all the IP we have locked. And why do they do that? Because they want to get investment, right? And so it's like this, and then there you have like journalists citing the press releases, right? Which I know Symposia has like kind of carefully shown that triangulation of how it's like, not necessarily the most unbiased source to say like, we have this novel invention that's not even approved yet and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, I don't know if Graham wants to chime in, but the thing I would say about the sort of risk of hype being an investment vehicle and where we need to deal with that is venture capital firms, right, who want to put their money somewhere, want to back something that's going to make them money, right? That's one element of it. But if we want money and resources to be used effectively, we need people in decision-making positions who are hopefully going to be directing that money to companies that are actually making innovations rather than buying into hype and doing pump and dump schemes, right? So just from an economic perspective, that's a risk of hype, is you basically have inefficient use of capital, right? Which is like a pretty narrow problem in the grand scheme of things. But if we're working within this capitalist system, then even through that lens, right, it's a bad market.
Graham, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I'm nodding along with what you're saying. I mean, I think it is a bad system. I mean, part of it, maybe just to sort of add on it, is just a product of the fact that most investment now is, it has been somewhat in the past from philanthropy, but now it's mostly driven by just private venture capital money, and that all just kind of rides the wave of the hype. I mean, I think that venture capital companies put money into companies that are sort of riding the hype bubble, and then they, sell those companies to their limited partners based on the hype bubble that their, investors see. So maybe I don't know if government necessarily is the sort of soberest and best investor to find the things with the longer term value, or maybe the ones that avoid the hype cycle, but certainly getting investment from sources other than ones that really are looking out toward just the kind of profit maximizing form of, where they're putting their money might be certainly an advantage.
Thanks.
So my question is for Graham. As psychedelics improve in the field of research, I'm curious about the realm of psychedelic malpractice and potential citizens who are attempting to utilize psychedelics as a means for financial incentive or financial gain. As to say, like, how could we concretely prove whether or not psychedelic assisted therapies caused a psychotic event or PTSD?
And yeah, it's a good question. I must say it's not my area of legal expertise. I mean, I imagine that there likely can be some causality there that's actionable from a legal perspective. And I think there are some lawyers who are working on it from a kind of insurance perspective in terms of kind of what the negligence laws would be. And I think already like in Oregon, and I'm sure with ketamine clinics, they're looking at their sort of malpractice insurance, but I don't have many more specific answers than that. And maybe I missed part of your question. It was a little hard to hear.
It's a little open-ended.
I put it in the chat too, Graham, if you wanna.
Okay.
And then maybe, I don't know if Michelle or what do you have anything to say about malpractice?
I won't go into it right now, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have an answer to how you would show that sort of causality.
I would assume a lot of consents are necessary.
Yeah, yeah, most likely. I mean, I'm sure people are going to have much higher, insurance for their malpractice than you would if you're doing braces or something. But
Well, I never I never not take the opportunity to plug the Power Trip podcast. And I would say that part of the reason if folks have not listened to it, that you should, is because it documents this like long-standing legacy of abuse that's happened both underground and above ground. And part of the reason that's so significant is because it happened during FDA clinical trials, which is going to be the most regulated context for psychedelic taking, right? So like once it is approved by the FDA, that regulation, it won't be as tightly regulated. So if it's happening in those contexts, then so. But yeah, and we had a question on another day.
I did. I'm John. Since I'm in the PPI program here, I for Graham and anyone else. I'm a lawyer in Madison. I think I'm the only lawyer in the program at the moment. So I'm having this gap. There is a gap between Cody's concern with delivery, the patents. But aren't these substances still criminalized? How is it that these substances are going to come into a pipeline in a good manner? Because here in Wisconsin, I don't know of any movement anywhere, any politician who wants to decriminalize psilocybin or that. And I know, of course, what's happened in Oregon and select municipalities, mostly all in the West. How's this going to happen? What are we going to get from our discussion, our research, and so forth to a place where these can actually be delivered? And then maybe have malpractices, because we can't have malpractices because nobody can do this legally, at least here. So I guess this is for you, Graham, and where do you see this going? And I guess my other question with this, patents that are being granted, are they being granted for criminalized substances?
Yes.
yeah, I mean, there have been probably 10,000 or 12,000 or more in cannabis, ever since the sort of first cannabis adult use markets. And there may be somewhat near that many in a decade with psychedelics, and maybe even before psychedelics have been federally legalized. There's no limitation on patents for anything that's illegal, with really two exceptions: nuclear weapons and human clones. But I mean, like if you have a method for making meth in your bathtub, you could, if it's new, get a patent on it. It doesn't matter if it's illegal or not. So yes, I mean, I think the question about whether or not you can pursue people who are performing activities that are illegal is a different one. And actually there is, and maybe it's not necessarily a question to get into here because it's pretty technical, but there is some questions over enforceability of patents. And there's actually a motion to dismiss filed in an Oregon case around cannabis, around a patent suit saying that it shouldn't be held enforceable because it's on illegal activity. And there have been some things not patent related, but contract and bankruptcy related in the cannabis space where the court has refused to hear cases because they've been around federally illegal activities. But for instance, there's a patent that's been granted on a DMT vape pen, and it was granted by, it was applied for by a patent lawyer, and I have some inclination to think that he's kind of staging himself to be a patent troll of sorts. He's filed a bunch of other kind of trollish patents in the cannabis space. And I would actually not be surprised if he would pursue people who are very clearly selling illegal DMT vape pens for patent infringement with the hopes of getting some sort of, settlement from them. Because, imagine if you could say, well, I'll take you to court, we'll ask for your finances, you'll have to like tell the, open up your books to the court, show them that you're doing all these illegal activities, where you're getting your money, you haven't been paying taxes on them. So I think even if you're, selling things that are illegal under the law, it's still a possibility that you'll be at the end of a patent infringement suit. So these can still be, used by people. But I think in the main, any of these patents really aren't going to make much sort of matter on the market until there's a broader market where you have more states like Oregon, or more companies like a Field Trip, or a kind of national chain that's has clinics across the country that's potentially performing methods where the millions of dollars it takes sometimes to fight a patent suit makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I know we just have a couple more minutes, and I know Paul has a question, so if you just have a quick thing, then we can go to Paul.
Very quick, just on the other pathway, well, one of the other pathways. So decriminalization, right, is another one, but I'm going to talk about FDA. So the pathway forward for FDA, for example, would be to go through the full phase clinical trial, get FDA approval, which would then trigger DEA switch in the controlled substances rescheduling. And this has happened, for example, with THC in the context of dronabinol and Marinol, very sort of narrow delivery metrics. So that's the pathway kind of through the FDA.
I'll also just say very quickly that another aspect of the patent issue is that potentially some of these patents being filed will inhibit that type of research, right? Or could, right? Somebody with a patent could say, oh, you can't complete this FDA trial because I just patented that. So, yeah, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Really quick. As a follow-up comment to the question of criminalization, I received absentee ballot for the state of Wisconsin November election. I have 3 questions on the ballot. 2 have to do with marijuana. 1, should it be decriminalized? 2, should minor penalties be expunged? The 3rd was about abortion. The 2 on marijuana on the upcoming election.
Unfortunately, they don't have binding ballot referendum in Wisconsin.
And so for, yeah, okay. So got that. And I think there was actually one question in the chat. Maybe I'll just read that out loud real quick as an ending point. And if folks have to leave at 5, that's totally cool. But thank you for coming. If you guys leave at 5, whether that's virtually or in person. So Shannon asks, for clinics popping up who mean well and want to make these therapies available to people but don't have the depth of knowledge that this incredible forum has, what advice do you have, especially in terms of doing no harm, enabling practitioners to be held accountable and not hindering the field as it develops further? It's a big question. Anyone from our panel want to take a stab at it, or any aspect of it?
I'll take a stab at least at the first part, right? We have many examples as medical practitioners of people using therapies off label for a whole host of indications, and that's the system we have to live with. I would say basically we have to be bound by our internal ethical and professional codes, and do no harm is a critical precept. So if you feel like you don't have the knowledge to do this safely in your patient population, don't.
Yeah. That's a good one. All right.
So we want to thank everyone for being here in person and also being with us virtually. We want to thank the speakers again. Can we actually clap? It's lovely to connect with you virtually and here face to face. More Borghesi-Mellon workshops coming up here. Sure, the very next one is October 3rd, 3:30. And that's going to be at Allen Centennial Gardens, which is just down the road from here. You can learn about psychoactive plants. And for those of you out there, we're going to also have more virtual events coming up this semester, and we'll be sending out announcements. So thanks everyone again. Really appreciate your time. Graham, we really appreciate you giving us the time from This is in San Francisco.
Marital.
San Francisco, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. So good to be here. And I will be actually my first time in Madison for the Psychedelic Symposium at the end of October. So
Yay.
very much looking forward to seeing whoever's here in person.
Cool. Can't wait. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.